The night of January the 14th, Dana White announced the departure of Francis Ngannou, with the heavyweight champion being released by the UFC, now being a free agent. This now means the UFC no longer has an African champion, which has brought an end to the legendary Three Kings faction of Kamaru Usman, Israel Adesanya and Francis Ngannou. With being three of the most feared individuals in their divisions until now, has created some legendary history and iconic moments. So let's look into it. This is the Fight franchise and the story of the Three Kings of the UFC. The Three Kings was made up of three of the best fighters in the world. Kamaru Usman, who was born in Auchi, Nigeria and moved to America with his family and faced crazy adversity in his personal life with his father's personal problems and imprisonment. Kamaru would become a brilliant collegiate wrestler, which would help build the foundation for his MMA success. Israel Adesanya would make up the second of the Three Kings, born in Lagos, Nigeria, and moving to New Zealand. Adesanya had a crazy upbringing, facing adversity through bullying, eventually starting kickboxing at 18 and turning into one of the best kickboxers in the world. This would lead to becoming one of the best fighters the UFC has ever seen. The final of the Three Kings was Francis Ngannou. Born in a small village in Cameroon, he would have one of the craziest upbringings working in a sand quarry from the age of 10 years old and escaping from Cameroon all the way to France in the hopes for a better life. This has gone all the way to becoming the baddest man on the planet, winning the heavyweight championship of the UFC. The first we saw of any of these three would be Kamaru Usman, who would storm the Ultimate Fighter Season 21 and capping off the show with the win in the second round through an arm triangle. This would see Kamaru fight later that year in December of 2015 against future foe Leon Edwards, where he would win a decision. This card was special, as it saw fellow African Francis Ngannou debut in the UFC, securing a brilliant KO. From here onwards, both men would dominate and buzzsaw through their divisions, with Kamaru scoring good wins. However, they would be very decision heavy, while Francis would destroy the competition in the heavyweight division, finishing everyone who would share the octagon with him, which culminated at UFC 218 with a KO of the year versus Alistair Overeem. This led Francis Ngannou to a title opportunity at UFC 220, where Francis had the opportunity to become the first African champion. After a frantic first round, Francis would be out-wrestled and exposed for his lack of cardio and losing to Stipe Miocic and falling down the heavyweight ladder. 2 months after UFC 221, we would see the last of the Three Kings debut, Israel Adesanya, who would burst on the scene with the performance of the night versus Rob Wilkinson. Israel would pick up another performance of the night versus Brad Tavares. Kamaru Usman at the same time would slowly climb the welterweight pecking order, beating jiu-jitsu standout Damian Maia. Unfortunately for Francis, his trajectory was on the down. Coming off his loss in the title fight, he would fight the Black Beast Derek Lewis and lose a decision in one of the worst heavyweight fights of all time. November of 2018 would be one of the most crucial and important months of all three guys' career, but at the time they wouldn't know how important it really was. With all three guys fighting on different cards throughout the month, this led to the push and title surges of Kamaru and Izzy, and began the revitalization of Francis' career. The month started with Israel Adesanya putting on another performance of the night versus Derek Brunson, finishing him in Madison Square Garden, truly announcing the Nigerian-born New Zealander on the world stage. Then, in the fight of the night in China, on a 2-fight losing streak, Francis rematched Curtis Blades and would KO him once again, stopping him in the second round, which would be the beginning of his career resurgence. The end of the month, Kamaru Usman would face RDA and secure his first ever bonus, with the performance of the night dominating RDA and showing he is at the top of the food chain in the welterweight division. With Francis back in the win column, Izzy star about to blow up, and Kamaru now in the top of the welterweight division, the Three Kings stock was on the up. 2019 is when both Israel Adesanya and Kamaru Usman went on to a whole nother level. Israel would open his year with a legendary fight versus Anderson Silva, which will go down in history books as the passing of the torch in the middleweight division, beating Silva in a fight which more looked like a dance rather than a fight. Francis would brutally finish who many fans believed was the best heavyweight of all time, Cain Velasquez, beating him in 26 seconds. But it was Kamaru who had his biggest test. He would be fighting legendary welterweight Tyron Woodley, who was mopping up the division and was hot on the tails of chasing GSP as the greatest welterweight of all time. At UFC 235, Kamaru had the opportunity Francis failed to achieve, to become the first ever African-born UFC champion. Kamaru Usman went into the fight with the full support of his peers. With Israel scheduled to fight Gastelum for interim gold a month later, it would mean Kamaru would have the opportunity to set history first. With many fans thinking Israel would be jealous if Kamaru Usman would be successful, Izzy would state, "Why would I be jealous if Kamaru does it first? It will mean Nigeria and Africa have two champions." And on March 2nd, 2019, history took place, with Kamaru Usman dominating Woodley, winning all 5 rounds and becoming the welterweight champion, crowning him the first African-born champion and showing what is possible for his people. Israel Adesanya a month later followed in his countryman's footsteps and claimed interim gold versus Gastelum in the fight of the year, going back and forth in a brutal war, with Izzy coming out the victor. In the space of 2 months, Nigeria had 2 belt holders, elevating the country to a whole new light, showing what Nigeria and its people are capable of in the MMA world. Towards the end of the year, both men came up against the toughest test of their career. Israel would unify gold versus Robert Whittaker, and Kamaru would face fellow collegiate wrestler and stand-down welterweight Colby Covington. Israel in Australia, in Whittaker's home country, stole the show. In the highest attended UFC pay-per-view ever, Adesanya would come out dancing in his entrance and dance around the octagon and KO Whittaker in the second round, securing the undisputed gold, cementing himself as the king of the middleweight division. Kamaru would for years be criticised by fans for his boring grapple-heavy style, with many fans expecting him to be a boring champion, but his first title defence would be a back-and-forth striking war versus Colby Covington, with the fight being razor close, with it being even going into the 5th round. Kamaru Usman would secure the stoppage in the 5th round, and his title reign had now truly begun. From here onwards, both men dominated their divisions, beating all other clear contenders, with Kamaru Usman pairing up with his new head coach Trevor Whitman and upping his game, specifically his striking, where he would be finishing his opponents with beautiful crisp boxing, which was a rarity in his early career. This all culminated in a picture-perfect KO of Jorge Masvidal and a rematch with Colby Covington, in which he separated himself with his close rival, eventually climbing to the top of the pound-for-pound list, truly cementing himself as the best fighter in the world. Israel Adesanya would be amazing, but his career would be the opposite of Usman. Izzy, before he got the title, was one of the most entertaining fighters in all of the UFC, but once he got the belt, he operated on a much more measured approach, being more tactical with his striking, pitching out 5-round shutouts against other contenders in his division. He did show what he was capable of when he had an opponent willing to go at him, decimating Paulo Costa in 2 rounds, showing us that fire he had when he broke on the scene. Izzy got to the point where he cleaned out his division and went to chase glory, going up to light heavyweight to pry the title from the shoulders of Jan Blachowicz, but he would come up short, losing a decision to the Polish champion. But as Izzy said, he dared to be great. With both Nigerian champions' title reigns underway, this would inspire Francis Ngannou and bring the bond between the 3 fighters closer, with each one another supporting each other and celebrating their success. Francis would tear through the heavyweight division once again and earn a title shot against the man who made him look human and exposed him, Stipe Miocic. Francis Ngannou would go into the rematch with an ace up his sleeve, Kamaru Usman in his corner. Francis spent the years after his Stipe loss working on his cardio and wrestling, and having a level-headed Usman who knows what it takes to be the champion in his corner, Francis was ready to take on the task he previously failed at. Francis shut out Stipe's striking and wrestling, and showing how much he has grown since his loss, knocking out Stipe in the 2nd round with a brutal KO, climbing to the top of the mountain he was working so hard and travelled so far to get to. The UFC now had 3 African champions, 3 kings who at the end of 2021 made up 3 of the top 5 best pound-for-pound fighters in the world. With the UFC and Dana White and the 3 kings campaigning for a UFC pay-per-view in Africa, the 3 had made waves across the MMA landscape and showed what is possible for their people. But as they say, heavy is the head that wears the crown, and as the kings of their divisions, they would have their toughest opponents ready and waiting to dethrone them. Francis faced one of his toughest tests of his career, Cyril Gane, former sparring partner and brilliant tactical heavyweight. Francis would struggle versus Cyril, having to resort to wrestling to beat Cyril, all while battling a knee injury and facing politics around his contract with the UFC. Francis would have to spend the rest of 2022 out with an injury, and we wouldn't hear about his future until this year. Israel Adesanya faced 2 tough tests, rematching the man he took the title from, Robert Whittaker, and a surging contender in Jared Cannonier, coming out the fights unscathed with fans criticising him for his quote boring performances. But on the horizon for Israel Adesanya was an old foe, who already beat and knocked him out before in kickboxing. But before Izzy's showdown with Alex Pereira, it was Kamaru Usman's turn to show why he was the best pound-for-pound fighter in the world, facing former rival Leon Edwards, who Usman was able to get past on the first occasion. Leon proved to be a tough test to start out with, winning the first round against Kamaru, being the first person to take down Usman and hold him down. But Usman showed off why he was the best in the world, dominating the rest of the fight up until the final minute. And then, Leon Edwards would throw a perfect high kick and knock Kamaru out cold, ending the streak of one of the best UFC fighters of all time. Kamaru Usman was one off tying Anderson Silva's 16-fight UFC win streak. He was knocked off the top of the pound-for-pound #1 spot and most significantly lost his UFC championship. This was the beginning of the end for the three kings of the UFC. 4 months later, Israel Adesanya would headline at Madison Square Garden against former kickboxing rival Alex Pereira, who beat him twice in kickboxing, most significantly knocking him out in their second bout. But this was Israel Adesanya's realm and his division. This was the sport for the last 4 years he made his own. Israel, a lot like Kamaru against Leon, dominated most of the fight, even rocking Pereira at the end of the first round. Pereira had flashes of brilliance, but Israel controlled most of the fight. In the fifth and final round, Pereira had nothing to lose and threw everything at Izzy, backing him up against the fence, dropping him and then securing the TKO victory. In the space of 4 months, 2 of the 3 kings lost their crowns. But where are we now? Dana White announced at a UFC post-fight press conference on January the 14th that they couldn't come to terms with Francis Ngannou and couldn't re-sign him on a contract, which now brings an end to the reign of the 3 kings with no African champion in the UFC. From the highest of highs for these 3 kings to the lowest of lows. But alas, these 3 kings' legacy will be remembered forever. We have seen many fighters carry their country and their people on their back. For so long, Michael Bisping flew the flag for England in the UFC. Khabib carried the back for the people of Dagestan, and Conor McGregor for the Irish people. But these 3 carried an entire continent on their back. Most of Africa is poverty-stricken, with little to no opportunity for the common people. But these 3 carried an entire continent and showed what is possible for the people of Africa in MMA. Most of Africa probably didn't know what MMA was before these 3, but there are going to be kids inspired by these 3 who one day we may see follow in their footsteps and lift MMA gold. The 3 kings of the UFC was a moniker given to these 3 champions, as they were the first African champions of their respective divisions, and they all did it in the same time frame, inspiring one another to achieve greatness and elevate the sport and their people. With Francis' departure from the UFC, the 3 kings is now the 2 kings, but that's 2 kings without their crowns. But with rematches in the pipeline to reclaim their titles, it could see Africa get back a champion. The legacy of the 3 kings will be remembered forever, not just for what they did inside the octagon, but what they represented and how they stood up for themselves and fought for what they believed in. To come from obscurity to fight their whole lives for an opportunity to better themselves and better the lives of the people around them, you can't help but admire what they have done and achieved within the sport. Though we most likely will never see them fight alongside each other in the same organisation again, the 3 kings will stand the test of time as 3 of the most significant and inspirational MMA fighters of all time, and that is the true legacy of the 3 kings of the UFC. Did you enjoy the video? Put it down in the comments below. What is your favourite moment of the 3 kings of the UFC? Put that down in the comments below. Leave a like if you've enjoyed the video and subscribe for more fight content. If you enjoy football content, check out the football franchise, our channel dedicated to football content on there. We hope you enjoyed the video and we'll catch you in the next one.